Daddy's Little Erna. Chapter 7. Dad's Broken Heart. Dad never truly recovered from the shock of Mum walking out on him. Partly, that may have been because he lost his main source of income. But there is no doubt he also believed he had lost the love of his life and would never be able to replace her. Every night he would go out drinking to drown his sorrows. Although he probably would have done the drinking anyway, because he was already doing it before Mum left. His broken heart merely gave him another excuse. He never thought to hire babysitters when he was out, so if he didn't take us with him, Terry and I would wait for him to come home at night. Even if we grew tired and decided to go up to bed, we wouldn't be able to sleep, worrying that Dad might have been involved in an accident or a fight, or was so drunk he couldn't find his way back to us. I felt responsible for him. We knew that if something happened to Dad, we would be orphans with no family left to look after us, since none of our other relatives were showing much interest. We wished he'd take better care of himself, as well as of us, so we could feel safer. When we did eventually hear him falling in through the front door after closing time, we would hurry back downstairs to greet him because we knew he liked that. If we had by any chance fallen asleep, he would stumble upstairs to wake us so that he could weep to us uncontrollably about his lost love, falling on his knees, sobbing to the gods. He always needed to have an audience for the drama of his grief. "Jane, Jane," he would wail, "please, please come back." He would go on like that for hours some nights, and there was nothing either of us could do or say that would offer him any relief from his misery. If we tried to sneak away back to bed during one of these performances, he would go mad at us, determined that we should witness his torment in full and appreciate what a wicked, selfish bitch our mother was. It was confusing. I hated her for what she'd done to us all, but I still wanted her to come back for his sake and for Terry's. I kept thinking, why doesn't this woman just come back? Not for me, because I didn't care, but for him, my poor demented father, as I watched him pleading, begging the gods, banging his head on the floor, beside himself with grief. As I watched him punching the air and crying, I would hate her even more, but at the same time I remember wishing he would shut up about it and get on with his life, with us. He was the same wherever he went. Down the pub they all thought he was amazing for soldiering on alone after Mum had deserted him and the social services had taken away half his children. He spent hours telling anyone who would listen all about his woes. He would tell them of his struggle to get us out of care and regale them with the story of how he had beaten up the social worker who refused to let him see his children. He used to play the same record on the jukebox, that one by Charlie Rich. "Hey, did you happen to see the most beautiful girl in the world? And if you did, was she crying?" It was all about how a man had let the love of his life go and now realised his mistake, but too late to do anything about it. The lyrics fitted the picture that he held in his head of what had happened, and he played the same track over and over again, standing by the jukebox, tears streaming down his face, singing along like his heart was breaking all over again. I learned to hate the sound of that record. Just hearing the first few chords striking up would make my heart sink. Why did he always have to think about her? Why was he always pining for her when he had me, and I was willing to do anything to make him happy? When we were all at home together during the day, Dad had a little routine going. To help him elicit sympathy from everyone in the pub, he liked to take one of us with him wherever he went, like a little trophy to show what a good father he was, part of his act like Pussy the Corgi. Usually it was me who went because Terry wasn't quite as cooperative, and for some reason he was more willing to let Terry off these duties than me. His money always arrived on the same days. He would be paid his income support for keeping us on a Monday, and on a Tuesday he would get his child benefit payment. The post office, where the money came from, didn't open till 9 o'clock in the mornings, and he couldn't bring himself to queue like everyone else. So I would have to go to do his queuing for him, which meant that on those days I was too late for registration at school, so I could then spend the rest of the day with him. Or at least I could spend it sitting outside whichever pub he decided to take his money to, waiting for him to come out. Sometimes I'd be there for hours on end. The pubs had embossed windows that you couldn't see through, but when anyone went in or came out through the doors, I'd peer in, trying to get a glimpse inside to look for Dad and check what he was doing. Dad's friends kept telling Terry and me how wonderful our dad was and how grateful we should be to have such a great father, and that we should make sure we behaved for him and didn't make his life any more difficult than what it was. I was sick of hearing it all, especially as I always felt guilty for being the bad, inferior person that Dad was constantly telling me I was. I remember 2 old ladies coming out of the pub one time after listening to Dad's sob story, both of them in tears and bearing gifts of crisps and coke, telling me what a wicked woman our mother was. "You be a good girl for your poor daddy," they said as they handed over their gifts. At moments like that, I felt that my dad really was a hero for all he was doing for us, and Mum really was the villain of our story. Poor Dad. He needed to drink to dim the pain of his broken heart. When he couldn't bear to have Mum's clothes and wigs in the house for a moment longer, he built a bonfire out in the back and burnt the lot, like a mock funeral. He used to have some photos of her as well, which he kept on the top shelf of the pantry. But they disappeared too. Went missing one time when he was in prison, and the council repossessed the house, forcing us to move. But it didn't matter what happened to the physical remainders of her. He was never going to forget her, or let anyone else forget that the love of his life had walked out on him. There was one publican who used to feel sorry for me and ask if I would like to go and sit in his living quarters above the pub, rather than always waiting out in the cold. Sometimes Dad would agree, but mostly he would say no. "She'll be all right outside," he'd say dismissively, not wanting to be beholden to anyone. It was confusing. If he was as wonderful a father as everyone told us, how come there was never any food in the house? How come he never went shopping for us? How come he never went to work to support us all? How come he didn't make our bedrooms habitable or buy us birthday cards or cuddle us when we cried? How come he beat us so often when we hadn't done anything really bad? It's only looking back that I question all this, though. At the time I never thought it was unusual that he spent all his money in the pub and behaved the way he did. That's just the way things were. It's what I was used to. Dad hated the idea of buying anything in the normal way from the shops. He would never have belittled himself to walk around the supermarket with a basket and buy things over the counter like everyone else. He'd rather we just went without. There was never any breakfast in the house when Terry and I got up. Some mornings on the way to school I would strip the leaves off bushes and pull up stalks of grass just to give myself something to chew on, to starve off the pangs of hunger. Some of these things used to taste surprisingly nice and juicy, but they never did much for the hunger pains. After school, Terry and I used to wait outside the chippy at the bottom of our road, tortured by the delicious smells of frying and going in ever so often to ask for the crispies, which were the scrappings from the frying fats. We were also moaning at Dad for not going shopping, so one day, after he'd had a win on the horses, he gave us £5 each to shop with, That means you can't eat any of my potatoes or eggs, he warned. I'm not feeding you for a week. You can sort yourselves out if you're so bloody clever. Terry and I thought this was wonderful and headed straight down to the shop to buy ourselves a big box of cereal and milk and sugar, bread and jam, butter, all the things that were never usually in the house. Within a few days we'd have to go to him and admit that we'd messed up. We'd spent all the money and eaten everything we'd bought. He wasn't angry because he liked being proved right. Our failure had demonstrated that we couldn't manage without him and gave him another opportunity to mock our feeble efforts at being independent. Because there was never a meal ready for us when we got home in the evenings, whenever Terry and I managed to go to school, we would make sure we ate everything on offer for lunch, always going out for second helpings. Every so often, however, that would backfire on us and we would get home to find Dad had decided to come off the drink and had suddenly transformed into the perfect father. Where usually Terry and I did all the housework, we would come through the door and find him on his hands and knees scrubbing the house from top to bottom, or stripping wallpaper or painting something, while cooking an enormous meal for us at the same time, usually a sausage and potato casserole or sausage, mash and peas. I would be so proud of him when that happened and would tell all my friends at school the next day that my dad had given up drinking and loved me just as much as their dads loved them. Because we never had any warning of when these mood changes would happen, however, we were often stuffed full with school lunch and unable to do justice to the food he was proudly laying out in front of us, which would lead to another explosion of temper. He would rant on about how ungrateful we were and how he had slaved for us. Under his watchful eyes, I would force myself to keep eating, pushing in mouthful after mouthful, even though each one was making me feel sick, just to avoid making him angry or hurting his feelings. Sometimes these perfect father phases lasted a few days, and Terry and I would decide to skip school lunches to ensure we still had our appetites by the time we got home. But the first day that would happen, we would get in to find he was back down the pub. We would be starving. The cupboard would be bare once more, and we would know there was going to be nothing until school lunch the following day. Other days, when we came home from school, we would still find no food in the kitchen, but the house would be full of his hangers-on, people he had brought home from the pub with him. They were nearly always alcoholics or prostitutes, and they were often taking refuge in our house because they were in some sort of trouble and needed a place to go. Dad would never turn anyone in need away. He was always the first one to invite someone in and offer them a couch to sleep on if they came to him with any sort of sob story. He liked people to be dependent on him and grateful to him for being such a great guy, although he would turn on them in a second if he thought they were starting to take liberties or were taking him for granted. I remember a couple of Christmases when, for some strange reason, he decided to make an enormous effort for us. To start with, he would buy a box of After Eights because they were your mum's favourites. I hated the bloody things, partly because I knew it would mean he would get all emotional and upset as he ate them, and we would have to listen to him reminiscing about her again and moaning on about his broken heart. He never stopped talking about her for long, and any woman he went out with always knew that she came second to his Jane. She's all right, he'd say about any girlfriend who was on the scene, but no one will ever measure up to my Jane. He made sure we had enough food for a proper Christmas lunch for the three of us by spending days beforehand plucking turkeys in the kitchen and in the bathroom for a mate of his, thus earning some extra money to buy the food we needed. His fingers would be bleeding from the work, and every time that happened, I would be convinced he had changed. At moments like that, it would be hard to be angry with him for the way he behaved, and on the other 360 days of the year, if he had decided to change the way he behaved at any stage, we would have forgiven him for whatever might have happened before. putting it down to the effect of Mum leaving. But, if anything, his behaviour grew worse over the years, not better. And the little respites became fewer and further between. When the pubs closed at 2:30 in the afternoon, Dad would make his way to the bookies, scooping me up from wherever I had been waiting outside. I would trot obediently in his wake like a nervous puppy desperate for approval, desperate not to be left behind. He wouldn't talk to me much before disappearing into the bookies, and I would know that I had to wait outside again, staring into his shop windows at nice clothes and toys, or gazing longingly at any food on display, always hungry, always imagining that one day he might come out with enough winnings to decide to buy me something to eat, but knowing deep inside that he would never do that, no matter how much he won. Sometimes, when he did finally emerge, I would try to hold his hand as he strode off. "Don't be silly," he would scold, brushing me aside. "People will think you're my girlfriend." Holding hands with a child would make him look soft. I suppose whereas he thought having me trailing along behind him made him look cool in some way. How well he did at the bookies would determine what sort of mood he would be in for the rest of the day, and we would either be taking a taxi home, or he would be walking and I would be running to keep up. I sometimes tried to ask him how much he'd won or lost, but he always ignored the questions, as though I didn't exist, as though I wasn't worth talking to. On the way home, we would sometimes walk past a men's public toilet, and Dad used to tell me to wait again while he disappeared inside. I could never understand why he took so long in there as I sat on the wall outside, watching other men coming and going. Eventually he would come strutting back out, and I noticed that he often then had enough money to get us a taxi for the rest of the journey. It was only years later that it occurred to me what might have been going on inside the toilet while I waited. If he thought all women were sitting on a gold mine and should exploit it, maybe he felt the same about himself. If he had no money at all, but he had decided to make egg and chips for tea, he would send me into the little supermarket we passed on the way home to nick some sausages or bacon to go with it. I was terrified of being caught, but I was more terrified of the consequences of disobeying him. He would make Terry do it too. But Terry wasn't as good at it as I was. More nervous. Maybe the shopkeepers kept a closer eye on him being a boy and a year older. I used to just shove things under my coat and head for the exit, and never seemed to get caught. I was quite proud of my skill, and always hoped it would make Dad be nicer to me. But his moods were largely unpredictable. Sometimes, when he got fed up with Terry or me at home, he would lock one or other of us in the coal shed, which was just off the kitchen and was rarely full of coal. I think I was about 7 the first time it happened, soon after Mum left. Most often he would do it for no apparent reason at all, just because he felt like it. To begin with, I would plead with him as he dragged me closer and closer to the door. "Daddy, please don't. I'll be good, I promise. Please don't. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, I'm sorry." But he would just laugh at my pleading or simply ignore it. He never relented once he decided he was going to punish us. He would have seen that as showing us weakness, which he would never have been able to do. Once we were inside with the door locked behind us, sitting in the dark and cold on whatever coal was in there, we didn't dare to call out or make any sound at all. It was so black that it didn't make any difference whether you kept your eyes open or shut. I would sit huddled in the corner with my legs drawn up close to my chest and wait, my ears straining for any sound. Were there snakes in there, I wondered? Were there rats or mice that would eat me before anyone came to save me? Hearing noises from the normal world outside the door, like a telephone ringing or a door closing, or Dad's voice would give me hope, reminding me that I was only in a coal shed and that I would eventually be released. Sometimes, once he'd silenced us in the shed, Dad would fall asleep in his chair and forget we were even in the house, leaving us alone in the dark for hours at a time. Eventually, he would wake up in a drunken stupor, amble to the coal shed door, and seem surprised to find us still sitting there. If I had been in the blackness a long time, the sudden light would hurt my eyes when it finally arrived. Neither Terry nor I ever dared to intervene when the other one was being locked up, because we knew that we would suffer a worse punishment if we did. It was tempting sometimes to go and unbolt the door when I knew he was locked in the shed, and I know he felt the same thing when I was there, but the beating we'd have got from Dad just wouldn't have been worth it. In every other way, Terry and I stuck together, him and me against the outside world, but we never had the courage to gang together and stand up to Dad. It was always up to one of us to fetch the coal from the shop, because such a menial task would have been beneath Dad's dignity. The merchant wouldn't deliver it to the house because Dad never paid his bills, so he used to send us down the hill to the shop to buy it, and we would have to carry it back up on our shoulders. But these punishments and humiliations would have been bearable if that was all he had done to us. I could have found excuses and forgiven him for all of them if it wasn't for what he started to do to me.